When my parents said I owed them for raising me, I almost laughed. They didn't pay my college tuition, my rent, or even the hospital bill when I broke my arm working 2 jobs just to survive. But now that I was successful, they wanted repayment. What they didn't know was that I came prepared for this conversation. I had kept every single receipt. My name is Claire Weston. At 32, I've built a life for myself in Denver, a life carved from discipline and a quiet, relentless ambition. As a financial specialist, my world revolves around numbers, patterns, and the cold, hard logic of assets and liabilities. It's a language I understand, a fortress of certainty I've constructed around myself, which is why the summons to my parents' house for dinner, cloaked in the vague but urgent phrase "we need to discuss something important," sent a familiar chill down my spine. It was a language I also understood, one that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with obligation. The drive to their suburban home, the same one I'd escaped a decade ago, felt like traveling back in time. The houses grew more uniform, the lawns more manicured, yet our family home stood as a monument to arrested decay. The paint on the porch was peeling in long, curling strips, and a few shingles were missing from the roof, dark patches like missing teeth in a strained smile. It was the physical manifestation of their financial philosophy patch, the leaks only when the ceiling is about to collapse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and a faint, underlying smell of dust and old grudges. The lighting in the dining room was deliberately dim, a trick my mother, Carol, employed to hide the worn-out furniture and the water stains on the ceiling. It was meant to feel intimate, cozy. To me, it felt like a poorly lit stage, and I knew my role was already written. My father, Richard, greeted me with a booming, hollow heartiness, wrapping me in a hug that felt more like a capture than an embrace. He smelled of cheap aftershave and the anxiety of a man who has spent his life chasing deals that were always just out of reach. His smile didn't touch his eyes, which darted around the room as if looking for an exit. "Claire, so good of you to come," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Your mother's gone all out." All out was a roasted chicken, likely from the discount grocery store, a bowl of instant mashed potatoes, and a bottle of 2-buck chuck breathing on the table. It was the same meal they served for every occasion, important or not. It was the meal of manufactured celebration. We sat down at the familiar oak table, its surface scarred with the history of our family, a deep gouge from where my brother, Evan, had dropped a toy truck, a faint white ring from a hot dish I'd once forgotten to put a trivet under, a mistake for which I'd been lectured for a week. The silence was a living thing, punctuated only by the scrape of silverware on ceramic plates. They engaged in the requisite small talk, a flimsy shield against the real reason I was there. They asked about my job in the vague, uncomprehending way they always did, not caring about the specifics of risk assessment or portfolio management, only about the fact that it was in finance and therefore lucrative. I answered in clipped, professional tones, offering them nothing personal, no vulnerability they could leverage. I was a fortress, and the drawbridge was up. I watched them, my financial analyst's brain taking over, observing their tells. My mother's fork tapped a nervous rhythm against her plate. My father cleared his throat repeatedly, a sure sign he was rehearsing his lines. Finally, after my father had drained his first glass of wine with undue haste, my mother placed her knife and fork down on her plate with a soft, deliberate clink. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Showtime. Her face was a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern, her eyes shining with unshed, tactical tears. "Claire, honey," she began, her voice soft, laden with a practiced weariness. "Your father and we've been talking. We've sacrificed so much for you over the years. We gave you everything we could, a home, an education, opportunities." The words hung in the air, each one a carefully polished stone of guilt. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, not of shame, but of pure, unadulterated anger. Sacrifice. It was their favorite word. They wielded it like a weapon, a shield, a currency. I took a slow sip of my water, my eyes never leaving her face. I refused to give her the reaction she wanted, not the defensive outburst, not the filial guilt. I gave her nothing, just a calm, steady gaze that said, "Proceed." Her composure flickered for a fraction of a second before my father jumped in, picking up the baton with clumsy eagerness. "What your mother is saying, Claire, is that we're in a bit of a tight spot." He leaned forward, trying to project an air of man-to-man reasonableness, as if we were partners in a venture. "The roof. You've seen it. It's a mess. The contractor quoted us $60,000, and Evan, you know Evan, he's got a great new idea for a business, but he just needs some seed money to get it off the ground. Another $20,000 would really set him up." He finished, looking at me expectantly, a hopeful, desperate glimmer in his eyes. $80,000. He said it so casually, as if he were asking for me to pass the salt. The number was absurd, audacious, but it was the casual inclusion of my younger brother, the perpetual golden boy, the black hole of their finances and affection, that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit with the weight of their demand. I watched the confidence drain from my father's face, replaced by a sullen pout. My mother's mask of concern began to tighten into one of impatience. Finally, I lowered my glass and met their gazes, my voice even and dangerously quiet. "Let me see if I understand. You're saying that I owe you." The word "owe" hung between us, stark and ugly. It was the word they had avoided, the transactional truth hidden beneath their flowery language of family and sacrifice. My mother bristled instantly, her voice sharpening. The gentle martyr vanished, replaced by the stern matriarch. "Don't be so crass, Claire. It's not a debt. It's a moral obligation. It's what a good daughter does. You have so much, and we have so little. We raised you. We provided for you. This is simply your time to give back." "Give back," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room's suffocating tension like a razor. A moral obligation. They stared at me, shocked. Laughter was not part of the script. "Okay," I said, the single word sharp and decisive. "Okay, then let's settle the accounts." Before they could process my words, I reached down for the sleek leather briefcase I had placed beside my chair, the one they had assumed held work papers or a bottle of better wine. The metallic clicks of the latches opening were the only sounds in the room. I pulled out my laptop, a silver MacBook Pro, and placed it on the table next to my plate, pushing aside the half-eaten chicken. The smooth, confident motion of a professional preparing for a presentation. This was my world, my territory. I was no longer the child in their house. I was the financial expert in a boardroom, and they were the clients with a failing portfolio. My father's brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" My mother's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Claire, this is not a game." "No, it's not," I agreed, my fingers flying across the trackpad. The screen flared to life, illuminating their stunned faces with its cold, white light. I turned the laptop so they could see the screen clearly. "It's an audit." On the screen was a spreadsheet. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, meticulously organized and cross-referenced, a lifetime of financial neglect cataloged in neat rows and columns. The title at the top read, "Weston, Expenses, age 18 to present." The first column was dated, the second, a description of the expense, the third, the cost. August 2011. I read aloud, my voice as dispassionate as if I were reviewing quarterly earnings. First semester tuition, community college, paid via Stafford loan, amount $4,250. September 2011. Textbooks, paid from earnings as a waitress at the corner diner, amount $382. I scrolled down, line after line, the rent for my first off-campus apartment, the cost of the bus pass to get to my 2 part-time jobs, the grocery bills, the car repairs on the 10-year-old sedan I bought with my own savings. Their faces had gone from confusion to disbelief. My mother's mouth was slightly agape, a fine tremor in her lower lip. My father looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. I kept going, my voice a steady, relentless metronome of their failures. May 2014. Emergency room visit. Broken ulna from a fall during a double shift. Copay and subsequent bills. Total amount $2,112. Amount contributed by parents 0. I paused, my eyes flicking up to meet theirs. I believe your exact words, Mom, were, "If you weren't so stubborn about working, you wouldn't have gotten hurt." My mother flinched as if I had slapped her. I scrolled further down, past the student loan payments I had started making the month after graduation, past the security deposit on my first real apartment in Denver, past the cost of the professional wardrobe I had to build for my career. Every dollar was a brick in the wall I had built between my past and my present. Every receipt I had saved, every bill I had paid, was a testament to the truth they had spent a lifetime trying to rewrite. The spreadsheet was my declaration of independence, written in the language of numbers they could not dispute. They were silent. The air crackled with what was unsaid, the years of emotional calculus, of favoring my brother, of treating my ambition as a betrayal, had all led to this moment. They had come to the table expecting to liquidate their emotional investment in me. They had not expected me to present them with a bill for their neglect. I looked at their pale, shocked faces, illuminated by the glow of the screen that held the truth of my life. The performance was over. The stage was bare. "You want to talk about what I owe you," I said, my voice low and clear, each word a perfectly balanced weight on the scales of justice. Fine. I tapped a final key, bringing up the grand total at the bottom of the spreadsheet, a number that represented every sacrifice I had ever made for myself. But we're not going to talk about moral obligations or family duty. I leaned forward, my gaze locking with theirs, two pairs of eyes that suddenly looked very small and very old. We're going to settle this like adults. The spreadsheet on the laptop screen wasn't just a collection of numbers, it was a ghost, a specter of the girl I used to be, and as my parents stared at it in stunned silence, the memories that built it, row by painful row, began to unspool in my mind. The true cost of growing up in their house wasn't measured in dollars, but in the slow, grinding erosion of a child's belief that she was worth an investment. It started when I was 14, the sweet, cloying smell of maple syrup, the greasy film on the vinyl menus, the constant clang of dishes that was the backdrop to my adolescence. I got a job as a waitress at the corner diner, a place where the coffee was perpetually burnt and the fluorescent lights hummed a weary tune. My first paycheck, minus taxes, felt like a fortune. It also felt like a lifeline, while other girls were spending their allowance at the mall. I was standing for 8 hours on aching feet, smiling at truckers for a $2 tip so I could buy the novels required for English class. I remember hiding the cash in a worn shoebox under my bed, counting it every night. It was my money. The first thing in my life that felt truly and completely mine. My parents were busy with their own venture, a dusty, flagging used car dealership on the edge of town called Richard's Rides. The name was my father's idea of catchy marketing. The reality was a gravel lot filled with aging sedans and rusting pickup trucks, monuments to other people's traded-down dreams. Their life was a constant, low-grade argument about money. The walls of our house were thin, and their hushed, angry whispers about overhead, inventory, and missed payments were the lullabies of my teenage years. "We can't afford that right now," became the family motto, a phrase that applied to everything from a school field trip to a new pair of sneakers. It was a mantra of scarcity, a reality I accepted without question. Except, the scarcity was selective. When my brother, Evan, turned 16, the scarcity mysteriously vanished. I remember the day vividly. It was a Saturday, and I had just gotten home from a grueling brunch shift, my apron pocket heavy with crumpled dollar bills. A gleaming, cherry-red, second-hand Mustang was parked in the driveway, not from the dealership lot. This was something my father had found a great deal on. Evan stood beside it, preening, dangling the keys my father had just placed in his hand. He was 2 years younger than me, had never worked a day in his life, and had just been gifted a freedom I was still paying for one bus ticket at a time. My mother stood on the porch, beaming, her camera flashing. "For our hard-working boy," she'd cooed, ignoring the fact that his hardest work was mastering the latest video game. When I later asked, quietly, if they could help with the fee for my SATs, my father sighed dramatically. "Claire, you know things are tight. You've got your job. Can't you cover it?" The pattern was set. Evan's needs were investments. My needs were expenses. His state university tuition was a foregone conclusion, paid for from a special account they had apparently maintained. My ambition was treated as a strange, slightly inconvenient hobby. When I started applying for colleges, I did it in secret, late at night at the library, using their free computers. I focused only on schools that offered significant financial aid, hunting for scholarships like a starving animal. The day the acceptance letter arrived, the one with the scholarship offer that would cover everything, I felt a dizzying surge of triumph. I had done it. I had built my own escape hatch. When I showed my mother the letter, she scanned it, her lips tightening. There was no hug, no cry of joy. She handed it back to me, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, her voice cool, "aren't you the ambitious little bookworm?" It wasn't a compliment. In her eyes, my full scholarship wasn't a victory. It was a sign that I was getting something for free, that I was reaching for a world beyond them, a world they hadn't sanctioned or paid for. I was leaving the fold, and worse, I was doing it on my own terms. The chasm between us widened when I was 19, home for a weekend from college. I'd been working 2 jobs on top of a full course load, one at the campus library, and another waitressing on weekends. One rainy Friday night, rushing to bus a table, my worn-out non-slip shoes did exactly that. I slipped, my arm catching the sharp corner of a counter on the way down. The snap was sickeningly loud, a sound I felt in my teeth. The pain was white-hot and absolute. When I walked into my parents' house the next day, my arm was encased in a thick plaster cast from my knuckles to my elbow. My mother took one look at it and didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what the doctor said. Her face hardened, and she crossed her arms. "If you weren't so stubborn about working all those extra hours, this wouldn't have happened." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no sympathy, only blame. In her narrative, my injury was not an accident. It was the consequence of my own foolish, unnecessary ambition. It was the price I paid for my independence, and in her mind, I deserved it. I paid the hospital copay with the last $60 I had in my bank account. The subsequent bills arrived for months, each one a stark white reminder of my aloneness. I kept every single one. When I finally paid the last installment, the hospital sent me a final statement with a huge, satisfying, paid in full stamped across it in red ink. I folded that document carefully and put it in the shoebox with my other receipts. It felt like a medal of honor. The word they used at dinner tonight, sacrifice, was the cruelest irony of all. When they said it, I didn't picture them working late for my sake. I pictured my childhood bedroom, where a persistent leak in the roof had created a sprawling brown water stain on the ceiling. For years, I slept with a plastic bucket next to my bed to catch the drip, drip, drip on rainy nights. When I asked my father to fix it, he would always sigh that same weary sigh. "We just don't have the money for a roofer right now, Claire." The bucket and the stain were my constant companions, a tangible symbol of their benign neglect. Yet, somehow, the year after my broken arm, they found the money for Evan to take a 2-week cultural tour of Italy with his friends. My mother spent weeks helping him plan. Her voice giddy with excitement as she talked about the Colosseum and the Uffizi Gallery, while I was eating ramen noodles in my dorm room, calculating if I could afford a new textbook. My brother was posting smiling selfies from a gondola in Venice, captioned, "Living my best life." I saw the pictures on social media. My mother had commented on every one. So proud of my adventurous son, you deserve it." That was the moment the last, naive remnant of hope in me died. It wasn't that they didn't have money, they just didn't have money for me. I was the utility infrastructure of the family expected to run quietly and efficiently in the background. Evan was the vanity project, the one they poured all their resources into, the one whose happiness was a reflection of their own success. Looking at their bewildered faces across the dinner table now, I finally understood. This wasn't a desperate plea for help from loving parents who had fallen on hard times. This was a collection notice. They had watched me from a distance, seeing my career grow, my salary increase. They saw me not as a daughter, but as a long-term, high-yield investment that was finally mature. After years of undervaluing my stock, they were ready to cash in. They felt entitled to the fruits of a tree they had never watered. My success was not my own. It was a resource they had a right to tap, and in their minds, the $80,000 they were asking for was a pittance, a small dividend for the monumental sacrifice of raising me. But I knew the truth. There was no debt. The accounts had been settled long ago, in 1,000 quiet moments of self-reliance. It was settled in a diner, with a pocket full of tips. It was settled in a library, under the dim glow of a computer screen. It was settled in a sterile emergency room, with a bill I paid myself. They hadn't raised a daughter, they had created a creditor, and the audit was just beginning. The silence that fell over the dining room was a physical entity, heavier than the uneaten food on our plates. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering. My father, Richard, stared at the spreadsheet, his jaw slack, the folksy, deal-making charm he wore like a cheap suit having evaporated completely. He looked like what he was, a small-time hustler who had just been called to the table by a shark. My mother, Carol, was unnaturally still, her skin a waxy, pale color under the dim light. The mask of the martyr had cracked, and beneath it was the raw, bewildered face of a woman whose primary tool of control, guilt, had just been rendered useless. My father was the first to recover, or at least to make the attempt. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound, and tried to regain some semblance of paternal authority. It was a pathetic effort, like a king trying to command the tides from a sandcastle. He squinted at me, his eyes narrowing not with anger, but with a sudden, desperate curiosity. It was the look he got on the car lot when a customer unexpectedly revealed they had an excellent credit score. How much do you make a year at that company of yours?" "Claire," he asked, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur, as if my salary was the key to solving this inconvenient puzzle. He was trying to reframe the situation, to assess my value as an asset, to figure out just how much he could realistically extract. I offered him a thin, humorless smile. It was the same smile I gave to overconfident junior analysts who thought they'd found a loophole in a contract. "I make enough to understand the difference between a sound investment and asset stripping," I replied, my voice cool and level. "One builds value for the future, the other liquidates a resource for a short-term gain, leaving it hollowed out." The corporate metaphor, my native tongue, hit him like a foreign language he vaguely understood was an insult. He recoiled slightly, his face flushing a dull red. My mother found her voice then, and it was sharp with indignation. She abandoned the soft tones of the wounded mother and adopted the screech of a cornered animal. A family is not a business. "Claire, how dare you talk to your father that way? This isn't about investments and assets. This is about love and duty." "Is it?" I countered, my gaze unwavering. I leaned forward slightly, my posture mirroring that of a negotiator about to close a deal, because love doesn't come with a price tag of $80,000. Duty doesn't demand seed money for another one of Evan's get-rich-quick schemes. You're the ones who put this on a balance sheet the moment you said I owed you. I paused, letting the word hang in the air between us again. So don't get sentimental on me now. If a family isn't a business, then stop sending me invoices. The silence that followed was even more profound. My words had drawn a line in the sand. On one side was the nebulous, manipulative world of unwritten family obligations they thrived in. On the other was the clear, unforgiving world of transactions and accountability where I now lived. And then, from the end of the table, a new voice piped up, thick with the righteous fury of the entitled. My brother, Evan. For most of the confrontation, he had been staring at his phone, probably scrolling through social media, a bored prince waiting for the tedious court proceedings to conclude so he could receive his tribute. Now, his face was screwed up in a mask of childish outrage. That's it. That's what this is about, he sneered, tossing his phone onto the table with a clatter. I can't believe how selfish you are. Unbelievably selfish. He pointed a finger at me, a finger that had never been calloused by a day of hard labor. Mom and Dad gave you everything. They gave you a childhood. You had a roof over your head, food on the table, and now that you're making good money, you throw it all back in their face with some stupid spreadsheet. What about all the things that aren't on there? Huh? What about birthdays, Christmas? They loved you. His voice was a whining crescendo, the anthem of a boy who had been told his entire life that the world owed him simply for existing. The mention of childhood was his trump card, the ultimate unquantifiable gift that I was now callously disregarding. He looked from our father to our mother, seeking their approval. My mother nodded encouragingly, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Yes, this was the right angle. Appeal to the sanctity of the past. It was a fatal miscalculation. You're right, Evan, I said, my voice dangerously calm. He blinked, surprised by my agreement. You're absolutely right. Let's talk about the cost of a childhood. My fingers moved to the trackpad. I closed the spreadsheet of my own expenses and, with a few swift clicks, opened a new browser tab. I typed quickly, my movements precise. The search results appeared instantly. I clicked on a link, a PDF from a government website, the United States Department of Agriculture. I turned the laptop screen back towards them. On it was a chart, clean and official, filled with data and projections. You invoked my childhood as an asset you provided. I began, my tone shifting into that of a presenter at a quarterly review. So, as a financial analyst, I feel it's only prudent to assign it a market value. According to the USDA's 2015 report, the most recent data set adjusted for projected inflation, the average cost for a middle-income family to raise a child born in that year to the age of 18 is $233,610. I let the number sink in. It was an astronomical figure, a sum so far beyond their comprehension that it might as well have been the distance to the moon. Evan's jaw hung open. That figure, I continued, relentless, accounts for housing, food, transportation, healthcare, clothing, and other miscellaneous costs. It's the price tag for the very things you mentioned. Evan, a roof over my head, food on the table. I looked directly at my mother, then my father. Their faces were blank with shock. Now, let's assume for a moment that you met that national average. Let's assume you made a $233,000 investment in me. If a client came to my firm and told me they had sunk that much capital into a venture, I would expect them to have something to show for it, a portfolio of positive returns, a history of growth. In familial terms, that return would be a treasury of happy memories. It would be the recollection of feeling safe, supported, and valued. My voice was stripped of all emotion, a cold, clean instrument of truth. But my portfolio from those years is empty. I don't have memories of you helping me with my college applications. I don't have the memory of you comforting me after I broke my arm. I don't have the memory of you fixing the leak in my ceiling. When I look back at the investment you claim you made in my childhood, the only evidence I have of any transaction at all, I gestured back to the laptop, to the ghost of the previous spreadsheet, is a shoebox full of receipts for the things I had to buy for myself. The air in the room became thick, heavy, and unbreathable. It was the suffocating atmosphere of a tomb where a long-cherished family myth had just been laid to rest. The roasted chicken sat cold and congealed on the plates. The cheap wine looked like blood in the glasses. My words had sucked all the oxygen out of their world. Evan stared at me, his face pale, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked like a little boy who had just learned that there was no Santa Claus. My father slumped in his chair, looking 20 years older than he had an hour ago. My mother simply stared at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap, as if in prayer. But I knew she wasn't praying. She was holding on, trying to stop her world from shaking apart. I had won, but there was no triumph in it. There was only the quiet, grim satisfaction of a long overdue account finally being reconciled. I slowly closed the lid of my laptop. The soft click was a sound of absolute finality. It was the sound of a door being locked, a case being closed. I stood up, my movements fluid and unhurried. The meeting was adjourned. "I'm not giving you $80,000, I said, my voice now quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable verdict. "I'm not giving you anything. The bank is closed." I picked up my briefcase, my eyes meeting each of theirs one last time. "From this point forward, our relationship will have new terms and conditions. If you ever want to speak to me about family duty or moral obligation again," I said, letting the words hang in the air, a final, chilling proposition. "Have your lawyer send mine a contract. We'll negotiate the clauses. Otherwise, we have nothing further to discuss." After the dinner table detonation, I expected a period of cold, silent fallout. What I got was a strategic retreat. For 3 weeks, my phone remained quiet, no angry voicemails, no guilt-laced text messages. It was a calculated silence, designed to make me feel the void, to make me wonder if I had gone too far. They were giving me time to let my own conscience do their work for them. It was a classic tactic in psychological warfare after a full frontal assault fails. You lay siege. The new offensive came, as I knew it would, not with a battering ram, but with a Trojan horse of feigned vulnerability. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, reviewing a complex derivatives portfolio, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. I let it go to voicemail, a standard operating procedure for me. A minute later, it buzzed again, and again. The third call was the signal. It meant the performance was about to begin. With a deep, steadying breath, I answered, putting the call on speaker. "Hello, Mom?" The sound that came through the speaker was not her voice, but a choked, theatrical sob. It was a practice sound, one I had heard countless times before, deployed whenever a request was too shameful to be made directly. It was the auditory equivalent of a white flag, meant to signal total emotional surrender and elicit an immediate, protective response. In the past, it had worked. Now, it just sounded like static. "Claire," she wailed, her voice thick with manufactured despair. "Oh, Claire, it's awful." I didn't ask what was awful. I waited. The silence forced her to move past the overture and get to the libretto. "It's Evan," she finally sniffled. His business idea. The one he was so excited about. It didn't work out. The partners pulled out. He's lost everything. He's completely crushed." She paused for another heart-wrenching sob. "He's lost his job. Honey, he has nothing." I remained silent, picturing the scene on her end. She would be sitting in her worn armchair, the phone pressed to her ear, a tissue clutched in her other hand, her face a perfect mask of maternal tragedy. She was playing the role of the grieving mother, and I was cast as the stoic, wealthy daughter who held the power to save her fallen son. "Claire, please," she whispered, her voice cracking beautifully on cue. "I know things are tense between us, but this isn't about us. This is about your brother. He needs you. Could you please help him just one last time?" One last time. The phrase was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It acknowledged my past contributions while simultaneously framing them as a series of finite transactions, promising that this final act of generosity, would be the end. It was a lie, of course. We both knew it was a lie. It was merely the title of the next installment in a never-ending series. My voice, when I spoke, was devoid of sympathy. It was the voice I used with clients who were trying to obscure a bad debt. "How many last times is this, Mom?" The question caught her off guard. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by an audible, indignant sniff. What a thing to say. This is different. How is it different from the $4,200 I loaned him 2 years ago for his last can't-miss business venture, the one he promised to pay back in 6 months? That was a last-time show, too, if I recall. I'm still waiting for the first payment. The sum, so specific and unforgotten, was a bucket of cold water on her performance. This was the problem with emotional arguments. They dissolved on contact with hard data. She dodged, pivoting with the agility of a seasoned politician. The subject was no longer the loan, but my character. You can't compare the two. He was younger then, more naive. My God. Claire, have you no compassion? Your brother is weaker than you. He always has been. He feels things more deeply. The world is a harder place for people like him. You're strong. You always have been. The strong are supposed to protect the weak. That's how family works. You have to lift him up. It was the argument they had used my entire life, the central pillar of our family's mythology. I was the strong one. Evan was the weak one. It was a narrative designed to do one thing, to turn my strengths into an eternal obligation and his weaknesses into a perpetual entitlement. My resilience was not a quality to be celebrated. It was a resource to be exploited. His fragility was not a problem to be solved. It was a privilege to be catered to. They had burdened me with my own competence, shackling me to his failures. I have to go. Mom, I have a meeting, I said, my voice flat. But what about Evan? She cried. The desperation in her voice now genuine. The desperation of a manipulator who has lost control of the narrative. Evan is a grown man, I said. It's time he learned to be one. I hung up the phone before she could reply. For a long moment, I sat and stared at the city skyline through my office window. The logic of their argument was so twisted, so profoundly unjust. Yet it was the water I had swum in for decades. But now, on the dry land of my own life, I could see it for what it was, a cage disguised as a safety net. Later that evening, fueled by a cold, simmering anger, I did something I rarely did. I opened Instagram. I didn't follow my brother, but his profile was public, a curated gallery of a life he wanted people to think he lived. I scrolled through pictures of him at bars with friends, at sporting events, on a ski trip last winter, a trip I now knew had been financed by their dwindling savings. And then I saw it. The post was from 3 days ago, a full week after his business had supposedly fallen apart. It was a picture of him standing in a driveway, beaming, one hand resting possessively on the hood of a brand-new, metallic blue SUV. It wasn't a luxury car, but it was new, shiny, and expensive, a vehicle that screamed of a significant and recent cash outlay. The caption underneath read, "Finally decided to treat myself. The grind pays off, hard-working man, entrepreneur life blessed." I stared at the image, at the breathtaking, shameless hypocrisy of it. The lie was so audacious, so utterly disconnected from the reality my mother had just tearfully painted for me, that I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The anger dissipated, replaced by a crystalline, chilling clarity. This wasn't just about financial irresponsibility anymore. This was a pathology. They were living in a collective delusion, a self-created world where Evan's failures were tragic misfortunes, where his profligacy was a sign of his ambition, and where my money was the magical solution that allowed the delusion to continue. They didn't just want me to pay his bills. They wanted me to pay for his lies. They wanted me to subsidize the fiction of the hard-working man so he could project an image of success while my mother called me to beg for a bailout. My financial support wasn't just about covering his rent. It was about covering his tracks. It was about propping up their fragile egos, proving to themselves and the world that their golden boy, their precious investment, wasn't a failure after all. My refusal to pay wasn't just a financial rejection. It was an existential threat to their entire identity. My movements were slow and deliberate. I positioned my cursor. I took a screenshot of the Instagram post, the picture, the caption, the date, the likes. Then I went to my online banking portal, I navigated to my transaction history from 2 years prior. I found the electronic transfer $4,200 sent to Evan's account. The memo line read, "Business loan." I took a screenshot of that. 2. I saved both images to a secure folder on my laptop, a folder I had created after the dinner. It was labeled, simply, Weston. They had made a critical error. They had mistaken my previous compliance for weakness. They mistook my silence for acquiescence. But I wasn't the strong, silent daughter anymore, the one who would quietly absorb their dysfunction and pay for their mistakes. My strength was no longer a resource for them to drain. It was a weapon I was finally learning how to wield. I had tried to settle this with logic, with a spreadsheet and a conversation. I had tried to appeal to reason. It had failed because they were not reasonable people. They did not operate in the world of facts and figures, of cause and effect. They operated in a murky world of emotional debt and unwritten rules. And so, I would have to use a language they could not ignore, a system with rules that could not be bent by tears or rewritten by family mythology. They wanted me to pay for their pride, to settle an emotional debt they felt I owed them. Fine, I was prepared, more prepared than they could ever imagine, and this time, I would let the law do the talking. My contract and consequences approach to family relations created a new kind of silence. It was a Cold War. Waged through unanswered calls and unread text messages, they had lost their primary leverage, and without the ability to appeal to my sense of duty, they had no other way to engage. I thought this new, sterile peace might last. I was wrong. Their next move was a classic from the manipulator's playbook, The Manufactured Emergency. The call came from my father 2 months after the disastrous dinner. His voice was strained, laced with a panicky breathlessness that was, I had to admit, quite convincing. "Claire, it's your mother. She fell. On the stairs. I think her wrist is broken. We're at St. Anthony's." For a single, flickering moment, a genuine pang of concern shot through me. It was an old reflex, a ghost of the daughter I used to be. But my analytical mind kicked in immediately. A fall, a potential broken bone, not life-threatening, a play for sympathy designed to bypass my defenses and pull me back into the family drama on their terms. Still, the possibility, however remote, that it was genuine meant I had to respond. To do nothing would hand them a new weapon to wield against me, the heartless daughter who abandoned her injured mother. "I'm on my way," I said, my voice neutral. The emergency room was a chaotic symphony of beeps, coughs, and hushed, anxious conversations. I found them in a curtained-off cubicle. My mother was sitting on the edge of the gurney, looking small and frail. Her left wrist was already being wrapped in a temporary splint by a nurse. My father hovered over her, his face a mask of worried solicitude. It was a perfect tableau of domestic crisis. "Claire, thank God," he whispered, rushing over to me. I ignored him and addressed my mother directly. "What did the doctor say?" "A hairline fracture," she murmured, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's nothing, really. I was just being silly." So, it was real. But the performance around it was what mattered. I spent the next hour in sterile silence, listening as the doctor gave her instructions, watching as the final cast was set. Once she was discharged, I drove them home. The silence in my car was thick and heavy. When we pulled into their driveway, my father turned to me, his expression grave. "I'll help her inside," he said. "Claire, could you possibly pick up her prescriptions from the pharmacy? I hate to leave her alone right now." It was a reasonable request, a test. To refuse would be petty. "Fine," I said. "Text me the details." As I waited in the drive-through lane at Walgreens, my father called again. I assumed it was to add something to the list. I was wrong. He wasn't talking to me. Not really. I could hear my mother's voice in the background, sharp and angry. He had clearly forgotten to hang up the phone, or had hit redial by accident. "No other choice. Carol, what did you expect?" he was saying, his voice a low, frustrated growl. "You should have been more careful," my mother snapped back. "Now we're completely tapped out." Evan's rent is due on Friday. Well, maybe if Evan learned to hold down a job, we wouldn't be in this position. I don't know what you want me to do. My father's voice rose in desperation. The money from the roof is gone. The emergency fund is gone. And your mother's joint account is completely empty. We're broke. The pharmacist's voice crackled through the speaker, asking for my name. But I couldn't hear her. My world had narrowed to the 3 words my father had just uttered. Your mother's joint account. My blood ran cold. The phrase made no sense. My grandmother had passed away 3 years ago. Any accounts of hers would have been settled through her estate. Unless he wasn't talking about my grandmother. A sudden, sickening suspicion began to crystallize in my mind, a dark shape forming in the fog of their financial chaos. I paid for the prescription, my hands moving on autopilot. I drove back to their house, my mind racing. When my father came out to the car to get the bag, I handed it to him, my face a carefully blank mask. "Dad," I said, my voice casual, almost an afterthought, "when you were on the phone just now, I think you pocket-dialed me. I heard you mention a joint account of Mom's. What account was that?" The color drained from his face. His eyes darted away. A cornered animal looking for an escape. He knew, instantly, the magnitude of his mistake. "Oh, that," he stammered, waving a dismissive hand. Just an old savings account. Nothing. Really, your mother was just worried." He clutched the pharmacy bag and practically fled back into the house. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say goodbye. He just ran. His panic was the only confirmation I needed. Back in my apartment, the hunt began. My years as a credit analyst for a major bank had been my real education. I learned that every life has a paper trail, a digital footprint. People's secrets aren't in their diaries. They're in their transaction histories. I started with a memory. When I was 22, just before I graduated from college, I opened my first real savings account. It was at a small regional bank near campus. I remembered the chipper bank teller explaining that, because I had a limited credit history, their policy required a parent to be a co-signer on the account to waive the monthly fees. A standard procedure. My mother had driven down for the weekend, signed the paperwork, and I had promptly forgotten all about her name being on it. I'd used the account for a couple of years. Then, when I moved to Denver, I'd opened new accounts with a national bank and left the old one dormant. There was, I thought, maybe a few $100s left in it. I found the bank online. After 20 minutes navigating a labyrinthine phone tree, I was connected to a customer service representative. I gave her my name and social security number. I answered a battery of security questions that proved, definitively, that I was Claire Weston. "Okay, Ms. Weston, I have your information pulled up," the representative said, her voice professionally cheerful. "I see you have a checking and a savings account with us. How can I help you?" "Right," I said, my heart starting to pound. "I haven't used that savings account in a while. Can you just confirm the current balance for me?" There was a pause, the soft clicking of a keyboard. "Certainly," she said. "The current balance on your savings account is $1.15. The number was so small, so precise, it felt like a joke. "I'm sorry," I said. "Can you repeat that?" $1.15, she confirmed. "Looks like the last major withdrawal was about 3 weeks ago." My breath caught in my throat. "A withdrawal? I haven't touched that account in almost 8 years. Can you tell me who authorized it?" Another pause, more clicking. "Ma'am, it's a joint account. The other party on the account is Carol Weston. The withdrawal was an online transfer, well within the account's permissions." The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft, sanitized by a signature I had forgotten I'd ever allowed. "I need a complete transaction history for that account for the past 5 years. I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I need it emailed to me immediately." The PDF arrived in my inbox 5 minutes later. It was 12 pages long. I opened it, and as I scrolled, a cold, methodical rage built in me, layer by layer. It started 4 years ago with a small transfer, $200, a test, perhaps, A few months later, another, 500, then the amounts grew, 1,000 for Evan's deposit, 1,500 for car repairs. The memo lines were hers, little narratives of fabricated need. The withdrawals were sporadic at first, then became more frequent, more desperate in the last year. Evan's trip to Italy, the down payment on his last car, his rent, it was all there. A secret history of my life subsidizing his, a shadow ledger running parallel to the one I kept for myself. I did the math. The grand total she had siphoned from my forgotten account was $15,842. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply moved. I sent the 12-page PDF to my printer. I listened to the whir and click as each page emerged, a tangible piece of evidence. I stacked the pages neatly, tapped them into perfect alignment, and slid them into a manila folder. The next day, I sent my mother a single text message: "I need to see you. My apartment. 5 p.m. We have a financial matter to discuss." She arrived at precisely 5 p.m., her arm in a sling, a look of cautious curiosity on her face. She thought she was coming to hear me finally capitulate, to offer help for her injury. I didn't offer her a drink. I didn't ask her to sit down. I simply gestured to my coffee table. The 12 printed statements were fanned out across its surface like a losing hand of poker. She froze. Her eyes scanned the bank logos, the dates, the numbers. The color drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. She knew, instantly, what they were. Her first instinct was to lie. I don't know what this is." "Don't you?" I asked, my voice soft, without accusation, which was somehow more terrifying. "It's the history of our joint account, the one you've been systematically emptying for 4 years. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. The lie collapsed, and she moved to the next line of defense justification. She lifted her chin, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "You weren't using it, Claire," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "It was just sitting there. Your brother, he needed it." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the excuse, the simple, unadulterated entitlement of it, was almost magnificent in its monstrosity. She hadn't just stolen from me. She had reallocated what she believed was rightfully hers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list her betrayals. I let her excuse hang in the silent apartment, letting its foulness permeate the air between us. I watched her, a specimen under a microscope. I saw the fear in her eyes, the dawning realization that the rules had fundamentally changed. Finally, I walked over to the table and gathered the statements, tapping them back into a neat, damning stack. I held them out to her. She flinched, refusing to take them. "We're going to go over these," I said, my voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Every line item, every date, and you're going to agree to a repayment plan." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. I delivered the final, fatal blow, and just to make sure everything is official and properly documented, I paused, letting her feel the cold weight of the impending words. "We'll discuss the final terms in front of a notary." Her face, already pale, turned the color of bone. The fight went out of her completely. Her shoulders slumped. The injured wrist in its sling seemed to be the only thing holding her upright. She hadn't feared my anger. She had feared the cold, impersonal, and legally binding consequences of her actions. The game was over. The moment my mother left my apartment, the ghost of a daughter who might have shown mercy left with her. The pale, terrified look on her face as I mentioned the word notary was not a victory. It was a data point. It confirmed my hypothesis. Their entire operating system was built on the flimsy, unwritten rules of familial obligation and emotional blackmail. The threat of legally binding documentation was a virus for which they had no firewall. The next morning, I was not on the phone with a notary. I was sitting in the hushed, mahogany-paneled conference room of Ms. Evelyn Albright, a partner at a boutique Denver law firm specializing in financial litigation. Ms. Albright was in her late 50s, with a severe gray bob and eyes that could dissect a balance sheet from 20 paces. She listened to my story without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. I didn't present it as a family drama. I presented it as a case. I laid out the timeline, the discovery of the joint account, and the unauthorized withdrawals, supported by the 12-page bank statement I had placed on the polished table between us. I did not cry. My voice did not waver. I was a client presenting a breach of fiduciary duty. The total is $15,842, plus interest, which we can calculate at the prime rate. I concluded, I want it back. Ms. Albright looked at the statements, then at me. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not pity, but a kind of professional respect. This is remarkably well documented. Ms. Weston, she said, her voice a dry martini. Most family financial disputes are a swamp of hearsay and undocumented loans. This is clean. I'm a financial specialist, I replied. I believe in clean numbers. Indeed, she murmured. A formal reimbursement request is the appropriate first step. It's a demand letter, essentially, civil, but firm. It notifies them of the debt and gives them a deadline to propose a settlement before we initiate formal proceedings. Good, I said. There's one other thing. I want to move my assets into an irrevocable trust. Ms. Albright raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. That's a significant step. Are you concerned about future claims? I am concerned about the future, period. I said, my family has viewed me as their personal emergency fund for my entire adult life. I'm shutting down the bank. I want a legal and financial firewall so high and so thick that no amount of sob stories or manufactured crises can ever breach it again. She nodded slowly, a small, approving smile touching her lips. A financial emancipation. I understand completely. We can have the trust documents drafted by the end of the week. Signing those trust documents a few days later was one of the most profound moments of my life. It was a quiet, anticlimactic affair in a lawyer's office, but it felt more significant than my college graduation, more freeing than my first paycheck. With each stroke of the pen, I was building a fortress, my home, my investment portfolio, my retirement accounts. Everything was being placed under the protection of a legal entity that my parents could not touch, could not influence, could not even petition. I was severing the last vestige of the financial umbilical cord they had tried to wrap around my neck. The reimbursement request, printed on thick, intimidating legal letterhead, was sent via registered mail the following Monday. The fuse was lit. I knew the explosion was coming. It came, as expected, not from my parents, but from their designated attack dog. My phone began to buzz that Wednesday night, a string of text messages from Evan. The first simply said, "Are you insane?" I read it, took a screenshot, and saved it to the Weston folder on my laptop under the file name Exhibit A. The next message arrived a minute later. Mom called me, crying her eyes out. "You sent a lawyer after them, after everything they did for you. This is how you repay them. You are the most selfish, ungrateful monster I have ever known." Screenshot. Save. Exhibit B. The messages became more frantic. A digital temper tantrum. He called me names I won't repeat. He accused me of trying to destroy the family. He ended with a message that was less an insult and more a threat. "You're going to regret this. Claire, I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are." Screenshot. Save. Exhibit C. I did not reply. I did not block his number. I simply continued to collect the data. His rage was a gift. Every unhinged message, every threat, was another brick in the wall of my legal justification. He thought he was attacking me, but he was really just arming me. A week after the letter was delivered, the public phase of the war began. The whispers must have started on their street first. The sight of a registered letter from a law firm being signed for at the Weston house would have been prime gossip material in their quiet suburban neighborhood, but Evan, true to his word, decided to escalate it from a local skirmish to a global conflict. He posted it on Facebook. It was a picture of him and my mother, her arms still in the sling, both of them looking haggard and betrayed. The caption was a novel of self-pity and righteous indignation. I don't normally do this. It began, But I feel like the world needs to know what's happening to my family. My sister, Claire Weston, a high-powered financial analyst in Denver, has decided to sue our parents. Yes, you read that right. Our mother, who is recovering from a broken wrist, and our father, who worked his whole life for us, received a letter from her lawyer demanding money. She's trying to take their home and destroy them, all because they asked for a little help. Some people forget where they come from when they get successful. Please send thoughts and prayers to my parents during this heartbreaking time. Family betrayal, elder abuse. Justice for my parents. The post exploded. Within hours, it had hundreds of shares. The comments section was a battlefield. Distant relatives, old family friends, and complete strangers rushed to weigh in. Aunts and uncles posted messages of support for my parents, calling my actions shameful and disgusting. People I hadn't seen since high school were suddenly experts on my character. The internet, in its infinite wisdom, split into two distinct, warring factions. One side was firmly team parents. You only get one family, they wrote. How could anyone be so cold and heartless? She should be ashamed of herself. They saw a simple, black and white morality play the ungrateful child turning on her loving, elderly parents. But then, another narrative began to emerge. It started with a few skeptical comments. There are two sides to every story. One person wrote, "Why do I feel like we're missing some key information?" A few of my old college friends, who had seen me work 2 jobs with a broken arm, chimed in, "Claire Weston is one of the hardest working, most self-reliant people I've ever met." One wrote, "This story doesn't add up." My phone buzzed with notifications, friends sending me screenshots, asking if I was okay, urging me to defend myself. I ignored them all. Engaging in a public mudslinging match with Evan was his game, not mine. It was emotional, chaotic, and unwinnable. Instead, I logged into my own, rarely used social media account. I didn't post a long rebuttal. I didn't share my side of the story. I didn't attack Evan or my parents. I uploaded a simple, text-only image, white text on a black background. It contained a single sentence. Adults settle things with documentation. I posted it without a caption. Then I logged out. It was a quiet, precise, and devastating countermove. It didn't deny his accusations. It simply reframed the entire conflict. It suggested that this wasn't a case of emotional betrayal, but of a documented dispute. It hinted at evidence, at receipts, at a truth that existed beyond his tear-stained narrative. My post was a dog whistle to every person who had ever been the responsible one in a dysfunctional family. Every person who had ever been called selfish for setting a boundary. The tide of online opinion didn't turn completely, but it fractured. My post was shared thousands of times. The comments on Evan's post became more contentious, with people starting to argue with each other. Team documentation started trending in a small, ironic way. I watched none of it. I had made my move. The court of public opinion was a chaotic circus, and I had no interest in being one of the clowns. My friends called me, worried. "Aren't you upset? People are saying horrible things about you." "It's just noise," I told them, and I meant it. Their opinions were irrelevant. Their judgment was based on a fiction my brother had created. I didn't care if they thought I was a monster or a saint. I wasn't interested in their validation. I was only interested in justice, not the fiery, satisfying justice of a revenge movie, but the cold, quiet, methodical justice of a balance sheet. The numbers were on my side. The law was on my side, and for the first time in my life, that was all that mattered. My single, cryptic sentence posted to social media was a stone tossed into the digital ocean. I hadn't anticipated the tsunami it would create. My statement, "Adults settle things with documentation," was so devoid of the emotion my brother's post was drenched in that it created a vacuum of information. It was professional, intriguing, and it made people want to see the documents. The story began to mutate, evolving from a simple family squabble into a viral debate about money, entitlement, and the very definition of familial duty in the modern age. And that's how it landed on the desk of Dana Wexler. Wexler ran a popular, sharp-tongued financial advice blog called The Bottom Line. Her niche was dissecting the messy intersection of money and relationships. She was a journalist at heart, and my brother's vague, emotional accusations paired with my clinical, evidence-based response was blood in the water. She or her team did some digging. My name and profession were public knowledge. My parents' names were on Evan's post. A few discreet inquiries into public records likely revealed the existence of a formal legal dispute. The narrative was irresistible. A week later, her article dropped, and it hit the internet like a thunderclap. The headline was a masterpiece of provocative neutrality, "The Woman Who Sued Her Parents for Reimbursement and Won." The one part was technically true, if premature. Faced with the mountain of evidence in my lawyer's demand letter and the threat of a public court case, my parents had, through their hastily acquired local attorney, capitulated. They agreed to a settlement, a 5-year repayment plan for the full $15,842, secured by a lien against their house. They chose a quiet, humiliating defeat over a loud, catastrophic one. They had signed the papers the day before Wexler's article was published. Wexler's piece was brutal in its clarity. She laid out the publicly available facts and framed the story not as a family tragedy, but as a financial case study. She wrote, "While the emotional fallout is undeniable, the core issue for many young professionals is a financial one. Where is the line between family support and financial abuse? At what point does a child's duty become a parent's entitlement?" The Weston case, playing out in the court of public opinion, forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Are your parents your responsibility, or is your financial security your own? The article went viral. The comments section was a war zone, a raw, unfiltered cross-section of American anxiety about money and family. The vitriol was astonishing, but so was the outpouring of support. "Blood is thicker than water." One comment read, "This Claire Weston is a sociopath. I hope her money keeps her warm at night when she dies alone." But for every comment like that, there were 10 like this. My parents co-signed on my first credit card and then maxed it out on a cruise. I spent 3 years paying it off. Team documentation. And this. My brother is 35 and still lives in my parents' basement. They drained their retirement to fund his artistic career while I, the daughter with the stable job, am expected to pay for their medical bills. This story is my vindication. The phrase that appeared again and again, a rallying cry for a generation, was, "Parents are not ATMs." It became a hashtag. The narrative had been ripped from my brother's control. I was no longer just the cruel, ungrateful daughter. To a vast number of people, I was a hero. I was the one who had finally done what they had only dreamed of doing. I had sent their family an invoice. The public fallout was swift and brutal for my parents. They lived in a community where appearances were everything. The Wexler article, shared gleefully among their neighbors and old friends, was a social death sentence. They were no longer the proud parents of a successful daughter. They were the failed parents who had been legally forced to repay money they had stolen from her. The phone call came that Friday night. It was my father, and for the first time in his life, he sounded truly defeated. The bluster was gone, replaced by a hollow, brittle anger. My mother was on the extension, her weeping a predictable background harmony. "Are you happy now?" he asked, his voice rough. "Is this what you wanted? To have our names dragged through the mud all over the internet? To have our neighbors look at us like we're criminals? Did you do this just to destroy us?" The question was so soaked in self-pity, so completely devoid of self-awareness, that I felt a profound sense of detachment. They weren't ashamed of what they had done. They were ashamed of being caught. "No," I replied, my voice calm and even. "I did this to balance the books. You spent my entire life teaching me a very specific lesson, and I finally learned it." "What are you talking about?" he scoffed. "You taught me that everything has a price," I said. "My time, my energy, my ambition, my independence. It all came at a cost that you were never willing to pay. You taught me that love is transactional, so I'm just giving you back the lesson you taught me. This is the price for what you did. Consider it your tuition." There was a choked sound from my mother's end of the line, and then my father hung up. The next call, an hour later, was from Evan. His tone was entirely different. The rage was gone, replaced by a sniveling, desperate attempt at self-preservation. "Claire." "Hey," he began, as if we were casual friends. "Listen, that stuff I posted, I was really emotional. Mom and Dad were freaking out, and they put me up to it. I was just trying to defend them, you know?" The excuse was so weak, so transparent, it was almost pitiable. He was a rat, not just leaving the sinking ship, but trying to claim he was never even on board. "I get it now," he continued, his voice slick with false sincerity. "That stuff with the bank account was messed up. I didn't know the details. I'm really sorry. Claire, I really am." I listened to his pathetic absolution tour, feeling nothing but a deep, weary sadness for this man-child who had never been forced to take responsibility for anything in his life. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry that his side had lost, and he was trying to switch jerseys before the game was over. "It's okay, Evan," I said, and the words surprised me. But it was true. His actions were just a symptom of the larger disease. He was a product of their system, and holding on to anger towards him felt like a waste of energy. "You're forgiven." A wave of audible relief came through the phone. "Oh man, Claire, thank you. That means—" "But let me be clear," I cut in, my voice turning to steel. "While you are forgiven, the credit line is permanently closed. There will be no more loans, no more help, no more anything. You and I are emotionally reconciled, but we are financially estranged. Do you understand?" "Yeah," he mumbled, the hope draining from his voice. "Yeah, I understand." We hung up, and I knew that would be the last time I ever had to worry about him. The final call came much later that night, close to midnight. It was my mother, and she was alone. She wasn't crying. Her voice was small, thin, and eerily quiet. It was the voice of someone whose entire world had crumbled to dust. We sat in silence for a long time, the hum of the phone line the only sound between Denver and the ruins of her life. Then, she said the 7 words that explained everything. "We never thought you'd actually do it." It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a question, it was a confession, a statement of pure, unadulterated fact. All of it the years of neglect, the financial games, the manipulation, the theft. It was all predicated on one simple assumption that I would never, ever fight back, that their good, strong, responsible daughter would just absorb the injustice forever. A slow, sad smile spread across my face, though she couldn't see it. The entire complex emotional equation of my life had just been solved, reduced to a single, elegant variable. "I know," I said softly. "That's because you never saw me as an adult. You saw me as an asset. Adults have boundaries. Assets just have a price." Even though they had already signed the settlement, their attorney had advised them that a formal ratification in court would make the agreement ironclad and prevent any future challenges. Ms. Albright had agreed, noting that a judge's signature on the document would be the definitive final chapter. It was a formality, a piece of legal theater, but it was one I needed. I needed to see the story end, not in a shouting match in a dimly lit dining room, but here, in a place of order and consequence. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a tired, formidable building of gray stone, smelling of floor wax, old paper, and the faint, metallic scent of anxiety. The room we were assigned to was not a grand courtroom from a movie, but a small, functional civil court chamber on the 3rd floor. The morning light, thin and watery, struggled to get through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The benches were dark, heavy wood, scarred with the board graffiti of generations of people waiting for their lives to be decided. The air was cold, the kind of institutional chill that sinks into your bones. It was the perfect setting for an autopsy. I sat next to Ms. Albright at the plaintiff's table. I wore a charcoal gray suit, my own form of armor. Across the aisle, at the defendant's table, sat my parents with their lawyer, a harried-looking man named Mr. Davies, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My father was shrunken in his ill-fitting suit, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the floor. My mother sat ramrod straight, clutching a worn leather handbag in her lap with white-knuckled hands. Her arm was out of its cast, but she cradled it as if the injury were still fresh. They looked small, old, and profoundly out of place. They were two people who had built their lives on the shifting sands of emotion and unwritten rules, and now they were drowning in a world of affidavits and stipulations. The judge, a woman named Maria Sanchez, entered with a quiet swish of her black robes. She had a stern, tired face, the face of someone who had seen every possible permutation of human folly. She reviewed the file before her, her expression unreadable. "We are here to review and ratify the settlement agreement in case CV 2025-914, Weston versus Weston," she announced, her voice calm and authoritative, echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Ms. Albright, please summarize the basis of the claim and the terms of the agreement for the record." Ms. Albright rose, a figure of crisp, professional competence. She didn't speak with passion or outrage. She spoke with the dispassionate clarity of a surgeon describing a procedure. "Your Honor, this case stems from a series of unauthorized withdrawals from a joint savings account, number ending in 5821 at the Mountain States Regional Bank. The account was held in the names of my client, Ms. Claire Weston, and the defendant, Mrs. Carol Weston." She placed a thick, bound document on the clerk's desk. Exhibit A is the full, certified statement of that account, detailing 12 separate transfers made by Mrs. Weston into her personal account over a period of 4 years, totaling $15,842. The transfers were made without the knowledge or consent of my client. She continued, her voice a steady, methodical drumbeat of facts. She referenced the transcript of the accidental phone call, the one my father had pocket-dialed me on, where he explicitly mentioned the draining of your mother's joint account. She presented printouts of Evan's text messages, not as a primary claim, but as supporting evidence establishing a pattern of financial demands and subsequent harassment when those demands were not met. With every word, I could feel my parents shrinking. They didn't look up. My father's head sank lower, his shoulders rounding as if under a physical weight. My mother's spine remained rigid, a desperate, last-ditch effort to maintain some semblance of dignity, but I could see a faint tremor in her hands. This was their private shame, their secret history, being read into a public record under the flat, unforgiving light of the courtroom. The defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Weston, Ms. Albright concluded, have agreed to a full reimbursement of the principal amount. The settlement, which both parties have signed, stipulates a 5-year repayment plan, secured by a voluntary lien against their primary residence. We are asking the court to approve and enter this agreement as a final judgment. She sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Sanchez looked over at my parents and Mr. Davies. "Mr. Davies, do your clients have any objections to Ms. Albright's summary or the terms of the settlement as presented?" Mr. Davies stood up, shuffling his papers. "No, Your Honor. My clients agreed to the terms. They wish to resolve this matter today." His voice was tired. There was no fight left in him, or in them. They were not there to argue. They were there to surrender. The judge looked directly at my parents, forcing them to lift their heads. Her gaze was not unkind, but it was penetrating. "Mr. and Mrs. Weston, do you understand that by signing this agreement and having it entered as a judgment, you are legally bound to its terms, that you are acknowledging a debt to your daughter in the amount specified?" My father mumbled something inaudible. "Speak up, Mr. Weston," the judge said, her voice firm but not harsh. "Yes," he said, his voice a dry croak. "Yes, we understand." My mother simply nodded, a single, jerky movement. Judge Sanchez's eyes then shifted to me. For the first time, I felt like she was seeing not just the plaintiff, but the person. She held my gaze for a long moment before turning back to my parents. Her next words were not for the lawyers or the court reporter, but for them. "Let the record be clear," she said, her voice ringing with the simple, profound authority of the law. A joint account is a legal tool for shared access, not a license for unilateral use. No one, not even a parent, is permitted to withdraw funds from another adult's assets without their explicit and ongoing consent. To do so is a fundamental breach of trust, both legally and personally. At that, I finally looked over at them, truly looked at them. They were two strangers in bad suits, caught in the wreckage of their own making, and as my eyes met theirs, they did what I expected them to do. They looked away. My father stared at his shoes. My mother turned her head to look at the grimy window, as if suddenly fascinated by the view of a brick wall. Their inability to meet my gaze was the real verdict. It was the final, silent confession. They could sign the papers. They could agree to the terms, but they could not face the truth of what they had done, not when it was looking right at them. A wave of something washed over me, and it wasn't joy. It wasn't the triumphant punch of victory. It was a strange, sudden lightness. It felt as if a massive, invisible weight that I had been carrying on my back my entire life, a pack filled with guilt and obligation and the heavy stones of their expectations, had just been unstrapped and set down on the floor. I didn't feel happy. I just felt unburdened. The debt that had defined me, the one I supposedly owed them, had been a fiction, and the debt they now owed me was real, documented, and legally binding. The scales were finally, irrevocably, balanced. Judge Sanchez began to sign the documents. "The court finds the settlement agreement to be fair and equitable," she stated formally. "It will be entered as the final judgment in this matter." She looked up at me one last time, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Weston, the initial filing mentioned the possibility of seeking further damages for emotional distress. Given the circumstances, do you wish to pursue that?" The room was silent. "Ms. Albright glanced at me, ready to proceed if I gave the signal. My parents tensed, a new wave of fear radiating from their side of the room. This was it, the moment I could turn the screw, demand a price for the years of neglect, for the pain and the loneliness. I could make them pay not just for the money, but for everything. I met the judge's gaze, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of profound, unshakable peace. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and strong, resonating in the quiet room. "That won't be necessary." The judge held my eyes, a silent question in them. "I didn't come here for more money," I explained. "I just needed the truth to be officially acknowledged." A flicker of understanding, of something like approval, passed across the judge's face. She picked up her wooden gavel. It looked small and dark in her hand. She lifted it. The sharp, definitive crack echoed through the courtroom. Bang. The sound was a full stop at the end of a long, painful sentence. Debt over. Illusion over. I walked out of the courthouse and did not look back. I got into my car, drove back to my apartment, and closed the door on the world that was, stepping fully into the world I had built. In the days that followed, the most profound change was not a presence, but an absence, a silence. It was a silence so complete, so vast, it felt like a new dimension of my home. For years, the background noise of my life had been the low-frequency hum of their expectations, the silent, vibrating tension of my phone, always waiting for the next summons, the next crisis, the next demand. Now, that frequency was gone. My phone was just a phone. The silence was no longer a tense pause between battles. It was peace. My mornings took on a new ritual. I would wake with the sunrise, the clean, thin mountain light filtering through my large windows. I would grind my coffee beans, enjoying the rich, dark smell, the simple mechanical process. And as the coffee brewed, I would sit at my small kitchen table and read the single sheet of paper I had framed and placed on the counter. It wasn't a piece of art or a photograph. It was a copy of the final page of the court judgment. It contained very little text, just the case number, the date, and the judge's spiky, authoritative signature, but at the bottom, stamped in crisp, black ink by the court clerk, were the two words that had become my mantra, my meditation. Case closed. I would trace the letters with my finger. It was a touchstone, a physical anchor to my new reality. There was no surge of triumphant glee, no spiteful satisfaction in reading it. The feeling that washed over me each morning was quieter, deeper. It was the feeling of a prisoner, long since accustomed to the weight of her chains, suddenly realizing she is standing in an open field, the shackles fallen away at her feet. It was not happiness, it was freedom. A concept so immense I was only just beginning to understand its contours. It was the freedom to drink my coffee and not rehearse a future argument in my head. The freedom to check my bank balance and know it was entirely my own. The freedom to simply be. They had built their lives around the preservation of their reputation, a fragile construct of neighborhood gossip and social standing. In the end, they had lost it completely. Their name, once a source of pride, was now a quiet local scandal, a cautionary tale whispered over backyard fences. They had paid for their pride with public shame. I, on the other hand, had spent years feeling like my name, Claire Weston, was merely a subsidiary of their larger family enterprise, a name that came with a list of non-negotiable duties and obligations. By forcing a legal distinction, by making the court see me as a separate and wronged entity, I had reclaimed my own name. They lost their reputation, but I got my identity back. It seemed like a fair trade. About a month after the court date, a single, unfamiliar envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was a plain, white business envelope, and my name and address were written on the front in a slightly messy, unfamiliar hand. It was from Evan. My first instinct was to throw it away, to refuse any new point of contact, but curiosity won. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of ruled notebook paper, torn from a spiral. The message was short, devoid of his usual drama or excuses. It contained only 2 sentences. I started a new job last week. It's in a warehouse, stocking boxes. I get it now. I stared at the words for a long time. There was no apology, but it was the most profound apology he could have ever offered. I get it now. He was finally understanding the simple, brutal arithmetic of life that I had learned at 14. You work, you earn, you pay your own way. The world was not, in fact, obligated to fund his dreams. For the first time, he was not a problem to be solved by my mother, my father, or me. He was just a man with a job. It was a quiet, stunning victory for his own soul. I took out a piece of my own stationery, the heavy cream-colored paper I used for business correspondence. I wrote a single word on it in black ink, folded it, and put it in a matching envelope. I mailed it to the return address he had written on his letter. Good. It was all that needed to be said. It was not an invitation to reconnect. It was not a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of his first step into the world of adults. It was closure, clean and simple. I wished him well, from a great and necessary distance. In the quiet that followed, I had a lot of time to think about the nature of what I had done. The world loves a dramatic story of revenge, one filled with fiery confrontations and satisfying cinematic takedowns. My story had none of that. It was a revenge conducted through paperwork, a war won by documentation. I came to realize that true, lasting revenge is rarely about creating chaos. It is about imposing order. My family had thrived in the chaos of unspoken rules, emotional debts, and manipulative love. My victory wasn't in screaming louder than they did. It was in refusing to speak their language at all. I forced them into my world, the world of consequences, of balance sheets, of black and white truth. Revenge, I decided, doesn't need the messy explosion of a gunshot. Sometimes, all it needs is the quiet, irreversible click of a pen on a legally binding contract. The silence that now filled my apartment had a price. It had cost me a mother, a father, and a brother. It had cost me the comforting, if suffocating, idea of family that most people took for granted. But the silence I had lived with before was also incredibly expensive. It had cost me my peace, my self-respect, and $15,842. I had simply traded a toxic, noisy silence for a clean, healing one. I spent the next few months sewing my heart back together with that silence. I took long walks in the mountains. I read novels I had put off for years. I focused on my work with a newfound clarity. I was no longer plugging the emotional and financial leaks of 3 other people. All of my energy was my own. And in that quiet, focused solitude, I felt the old wounds, the 1,000 tiny cuts of a lifetime of being undervalued, finally begin to scar over. One evening, I was standing on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks of the Rockies in shades of orange and purple. The city lights of Denver began to twinkle below, a sprawling galaxy of other lives. I held a glass of wine. The air was crisp and cool, and a feeling of profound contentment settled over me. I thought about my finances, my career, my future, and for the first time, in all my 32 years on this earth, I realized a fundamental truth. I did not owe anyone a single thing. 2 months passed. The silence held. The first payment from the settlement arrived in my trust account via an anonymous bank transfer, a sterile transaction devoid of any personal contact. It was just a number on a screen, the first of 60 installments. Life settled into a new, quiet rhythm. The ghosts were gone. I was, for the first time, truly alone, and I found that I preferred it. The encounter, when it happened, was in the most mundane of places. A Tuesday evening at the supermarket, I was in the produce section, weighing a bag of avocados, my mind on the guacamole I was planning to make. The air was filled with the banal sounds of suburban life, the squeak of shopping cart wheels, the distant beep of a scanner, a child whining for candy, and then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the aisle, by the dairy case, examining a carton of yogurt. She looked diminished. The sharp, defiant lines of her face had softened into a map of weary resignation. She was thinner than I remembered, and her movements were hesitant, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in the world. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second across the pyramids of apples and oranges. A flicker of panic crossed her face, the look of a startled animal. She immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, becoming intensely interested in the linoleum tiles, and shuffled her cart away, down a different aisle. She was trying to disappear. The daughter I used to be would have let her. She would have felt a pang of guilt, turned her own cart around, and fled the store to spare them both the awkwardness. But I was not that daughter anymore. I finished my shopping, my movements calm and deliberate. I pushed my cart towards the checkout lanes, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I saw her in line 3 lanes over. She was staring straight ahead, her back rigid, a soldier trying not to be seen. I chose the lane directly behind her. She must have felt my presence, a change in the air, a shadow falling over her. Her shoulders tensed. She kept her eyes fixed on the cashier, refusing to turn, refusing to acknowledge me. The conveyor belt moved her items forward: milk, bread, eggs, the simple staples of a quiet life. I said nothing. I simply waited. When all her items had been scanned and the total appeared on the small screen, she fumbled in her purse. As her hand emerged with a credit card, I stepped forward. I reached into my own wallet and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was old. The thermal paper faded and creasy, the text barely legible. I had kept it in a small box with my other essential documents, a relic from a past life. I unfolded it carefully. It was a pharmacy receipt, dated October 12, 2008. The item was a prescription for my father's blood pressure medication. The total was $42.50. I was 16 years old. I had paid for it with the tip money I had earned that weekend. It was one of the first debts I never recorded on my spreadsheet, because it was a time before I knew I had to. I placed the small, fragile receipt on the counter next to her credit card. "Consider it paid," I said. My voice was quiet, not unkind, but as clear and final as a closing bell on the stock exchange. The cashier looked from me to my mother, her face a mask of confusion. My mother slowly turned her head. Her face was ashen. She stared at the faded receipt, this ghost from our shared past, and a tremor ran through her hand. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with 1,000 unasked questions. "Claire," she whispered, my name a fragile, broken thing on her lips. It was the sound of a language she no longer knew how to speak. I offered her a small, sad smile. It was not a smile of forgiveness, nor of triumph. It was a smile of finality, an acknowledgement of a long and painful calculation finally reaching its sum. "Let's call it even," I said. Then I turned and walked away, leaving my full cart of groceries behind. I didn't need them. I walked towards the automatic glass doors, my steps light and steady. The evening sun was setting, and the bright, golden light hit the glass, turning it into a momentary mirror. In the reflection, I saw the woman I had become, not a daughter weighed down by obligation, not a child fighting for validation, but a woman standing on her own, her account settled, her future her own. The reflection walked towards me, and I walked through it, out into the cool evening air. The camera of my memory pulled back, leaving the supermarket, the abandoned cart, and the ghost in the checkout line behind. No dramatic music swelled, no final words scrolled across the screen. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, took a deep breath, and whispered the words to myself, for myself, a final entry in a ledger that was now, forever, closed. We're settled. The screen goes black. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to connect with you all. So please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting that hype button to help it reach more listeners.